Finally, it seems after decades of developments coupled with announcements that electric vehicles would soon go mainstream, it seems we're on the cusp of that vision turning into a reality. Electric vehicles, EVs as they're commonly known, are more plentiful than ever, and depending on where you are in the world, more affordable than ever. The appeal of EVs in part comes from the increase in environmental stewardship awareness. That appeal also comes from consumers who simply want something different. At the heart of this change in consumer behavior, of course, are the businesses, car makers, and politicians looking to capitalize on the next big thing. Yet geopolitics, some argue, could also play a role in stifling EV growth. I'm Cody Combs, and on this edition of Business Extra Podcast, we look at the big question being asked by many: has the electric vehicles movement on the international stage finally arrived, or is this just another false start for the EV movement? Joining me now to discuss this ongoing adoption of electric vehicles with Hasan Nergiz, Managing Director of Futtaim Electric Mobility Company, and we're also joined by Aravind CJ, partner at the global consultancy company Roland Berger, which just recently released a new edition of its EV charging index. There's some interesting stuff in there, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, which takes an in-depth look at electric vehicles and their charging infrastructure. Thanks so much for joining us, both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cody. Happy to be here.
So September 9th was World EV Day, and according to some, it's the 5th year where World EV Day has been observed in parts of the world. I want to start with Hasan, and tell me a little bit about what that is and what it does.
So electric mobility is obviously like a very important part of our strategy in Futtaim. As you may have well known, in UAE, with the Futtaim Automotive, we are having almost 35 to 40% of the passenger vehicle market. So when we were looking into how the industry would look like within the same global trends, electrification and the electric mobility was a big topic for us, and we wanted to also invest and move forward with this. So we set up this company at the beginning of 2023. As one of the companies under the umbrella of Futtaim Group, but solely focusing on the electric mobility. So the other brands that we have in the portfolio of the automotive, it is taken care of by separate companies with separate management and separate teams. So therefore, what we do is in the electric mobility company, we just live and breathe and eat and sleep electric vehicles and electric mobility, not only in UAE, but now also in Saudi markets.
So the UAE and Saudi markets, we'll get into that a little bit, are pretty hot when it comes to EVs, and I mean that in a good way, of course, but are there still misconceptions a lot of consumers have when it comes to purchasing EVs?
100%. So we shouldn't basically forget that this is, at the minute, for the majority, if not almost all customers, first time to purchase electric vehicles, a new technology. We are all consumers in life. Imagine when we first bought a smartphone, it was obviously with the price positioning and all the benefits of it coming from the future phones. It's a completely different experience. In the cars, it's the same. From our families or from our parents, we have been only have an experience with internal combustion engine. It's a massive difference, and especially is massive difference when it comes to the charging, because the first thing that any consumer would ask, okay, I would like to buy an electric vehicle, but where I am going to charge it. So therefore, the experience is completely different. Technology is new. Buying cycle is longer. Consideration cycle is longer, but it is coming because of the novelty of the technologies. Obviously, having more brands, more products, covering more segments, and also mitigating all the, I would call it, the customer pain points. It's on the rise of the adoption right now. But I would say in this part of the world, it is still a start.
Charging stations. That inevitably is what we all end up talking about. And we do a lot of stories on EVs because it's interesting. People are interested, and everyone, for the most part, likes to look at cars and new cars in particular. But it always goes back to those charging stations. So I think we've done equal amount of articles on the charging infrastructure. I'm going to bring you in for this, Aravind, because you have the Roland Berger index. You take a really close look at this, and you look at range anxiety, because ultimately people want to know, I'm going to drive this car X amount of miles. I need to know I'm going to be able to keep driving it, or for lack of a better word, recharge it or refuel it. Where are things standing right now in the Middle East in terms of these charging stations and the charging infrastructure compared to the rest of the world?
Sure thing, Cody. So on the index itself, I mean, like this is an index which covers almost 32 markets for us. And we do cover around 31 indicators across the EV charging space, right? So that way we are able to establish a very clear view on what's happening across the world and where do we stand with respect to, let's say, the Middle East markets. If we look at UAE and KSA, the good news is these two markets are improving in terms of EV charging infrastructure throughout, let's say, our previous editions. This is done every 6 months, and in the last 2.5 years, we've seen quite a significant improvement when it comes to, let's say, installed chargers, especially in the public charging space. Now, in terms of the chargers specifically, let's say, I mean, starting with the UAE, we see that several Emirates have already installed or they are in the process of installing several charging infrastructure. And what that has enabled is that the likes of, let's say, Al Futtaim and a few other distributors, they are able to have more and more vehicles into the market. Now, the charger vehicle to charger ratio is still on the higher side for the market itself. But that is, again, for a lack of a better term, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation because consumers always say, okay, I need to see chargers before I buy a vehicle. And installers will say, okay, I need to see more vehicles before I go for more chargers and so on. So it's a bit of a cyclical thing. And that is, again, prevalent in every other market unless there are significant government interventions. Over here in the UAE, I think it's more of, let's say, an organic part. But still, we do see quite a bit of, let's say, charging related element, which is developing furthermore.
Where does the Middle East stand when compared to, let's say, the United States in terms of that charging ratio? Because that's what it's all about. And that keyword being ratio, that gives the people peace of mind.
Definitely. If we look at between Europe, US, and so on, again, underlining the fact that there is significant support, let's say, coming in for, let's say, charging installation in those particular economies, we are, I mean, as Middle East, we are a bit farther off. If we compare ourselves specifically here, we should be around, let's say, 18 EVs per charger kind of a thing. Again, given there is a significant sales happening and there are more and more installations happening, we are, let's say, above 15 is what I would term it as. And that is a bit farther away from, let's say, many of these developed countries. But then they've also been in this market for more than a decade now. Right. So they have had Tesla, for example, launch their own supercharging network within these particular economies. Whereas in the Middle East, that part of, let's say, supercharger network or OEM specific networks and so on, it's slightly on the lower end. At the same time, we do see several installations happening in the region. There are several private sector players, including distributors and including manufacturing, let's say, companies looking into getting into this particular space.
And to what extent are government initiatives playing a role in this? I mean, you could always have more government initiatives, and it would probably be a good thing in terms of these charging stations. But where do you see government playing a role in this?
Government, of course, can play multiple roles with respect to, let's say, the charging or, let's say, the evolution of the EV ecosystem itself, right? So charging is just one element of a much larger thing. Now, within the charging space, one side of it is, let's say, for example, around the policy or the ambition related part. Just to give you an example, let's say, in India, in Europe, and so on, there are already guidelines in terms of saying how many chargers per X kilometers of highways should there be, right? Meaning one charger every 60 kilometers, or is it one charger every 3x3 square kilometer? Those kind of elements are provided as guidelines from a government perspective. Now, what that does is it kind of helps the private sector investor or even public sector investors, for that matter, to assess what would be the demand eventually, which is going to be there. That's one element of providing guidance to, let's say, the overall market. The other one is, of course, in terms of, let's say, specific fiscal incentives, where many of these charging, let's say, installations receive actual subsidies in terms of either cheaper electricity rates or even in terms of for every charger, they do get some form of a subsidy to reduce the cost of, let's say, installation. Now, why is this important? It's the whole chicken and egg story again. If you need the infrastructure to catch up, there is an element of inefficiency which will be present during the early stages. In order to overcome that inefficiency is where you fundamentally need this support, and that is where it is quite important.
And Hasan, I'm going to come to you for this particular question. You often see this portrayed as a zero-sum game. People say, well, you can have a EV or you can drive a internal combustion engine vehicle. Are we looking at a time where we're going to see like a peaceful coexistence between the two, or inevitably will EVs just kind of take over and the ICE vehicles will be a thing of the past?
I mean, this is obviously, the direction is very clear. So the mobility sector will move into electrification. That is an inevitable end. But the question is actually, what is the speed of the transformation and when it will happen? If we are talking about everything will be electric in 100% by when? And why? Because if you look at the bigger picture of the what has been signed in COP28 in UAE and the government's net zero carbon targets, transportation and the mobility is actually around 15 to 20% of the CO2 emission in entire world. So without this going in a carbon neutral, there is no way any government in the world can hit their target. So this is the reason, and the electrification is being one of the carbon net zero targets. It will happen. So we are talking about here, obviously, if you look at this 2050, and depending on the ambition of the governments and the countries, it is hovering around 2045, and some of them 2040 and 2050 plus. In our region, it is more in the 2050s. So, and this will be a journey. So I think in order to see what in our region as well, how the things would evolve, we could look at the biggest country when it comes to the automotive sales is China. So in China, where there is a significant focus in the automotive industry for the electrification, or the new terms of the new energy vehicles meaning full electric as well as plug-in hybrid, that gives you an electric range of 85 to 100, which should be sufficient for your daily commute, for home to office, home to school, but also having a secondary engine, which gives you also for the weekend or the holidays for a much longer range. So in this context of the new energy vehicle, in just last month, for the first time in China, it overtook the entire sales within the month compared to internal combustion engine. And there are several, and that means that in China, of the net zero when it comes to transportation, already they are ahead of their targets, their curve that they are trying to achieve. So obviously there are several reasons and the repercussions of what is happening in China, which is the biggest car manufacturer in the world as well. So if you think about the biggest market like China is going into much faster to electrification, it means that there will be a huge issue for the internal combustion engine manufacturing costs, which was spread over much higher volume, now a lesser volume. So therefore, inevitably, the products, and even you can see from the number of brands that is coming from China as a challenger to the industries, number of new energy vehicles has been launched in the market and the surge to the global, this will be a further trigger on the curve and adoption of the electric vehicle.
I'd like to go with two more questions, if I may. Aravind, we're talking a lot about China. It is, in fact, the biggest market. In that report about charging stations from Roland Berger, it gets really, really specific about, certain cultural habits. In China, it says, I think, something to the effect of these community parking lots are where most of the charging takes place. That's not necessarily the case in the rest of the world, though, according to your report.
Correct. So that's a very good point, Cody. In fact, when we look at EV charging, or rather EV buyers, as Hasan mentioned, majority of, let's say, the consumers in Middle East are open towards buying EVs. But when you get into why are you not buying an EV, it predominantly comes down to one, the price, and the other one is the charging infrastructure. And that is where the element of consumer education and consumer knowledge needs to, let's say, be enhanced. Where if you look at 80% or more than 80% of the actual charging happens at home. If you take the example of UK, it's even above 90%. So technically what happens is all your range anxiety related part or the availability of charging infrastructure for 80 to 90% of your case is actually addressed through having a home charging installation device. And that is fundamentally where certain elements of regulations also need to kind of support this kind of a charging infrastructure where, for example, building code related aspect needs to be changed to accommodate, let's say, charging related installation within apartments and so on. If those elements are being addressed, and of course, with a bit of support from OEMs and distributors like Hasan, if consumers are able to get access to cheaper home charging solutions, then you address 80 to 90% of the challenge which consumers face. And it's only a matter of then having a few destination chargers, the highway related network, and so on, which will then help, let's say, address the whole charging related requirement.
And that's a great point. I don't want to grossly oversimplify the buying process, but ultimately this comes down to price. And for the longest time, the price for these EVs was significantly higher. It is coming down, but I'm a little worried is not the right word. There's a global concern about tariffs. You recently heard about Canada slapping a relatively significant tariff on Chinese imports. Are tariffs going to end up, kind of blunting some of this EV growth, or are the prices still going to come down on these vehicles?
If we look at the price related element, and again, taking the comparison of, let's say, mobile phones were cost prohibitive when they were initially launched. And now every one of us has a smartphone. And increasingly so, it's not that every smartphone is an iPhone. Similar to that particular case, I would say, even for cars, what we are seeing is that it's not only the premium or the luxury brands which have a car. Now, we do have, let's say, medium priced vehicles, and we will also start seeing, let's say, in the lower segments or the cheaper segments, there will be cars which are there. And specifically around the tariff related element, it will, let's say, impact a bit of the competitiveness coming in from, let's say, some of the Chinese brands into specifically markets into Europe and US. But that again is more of, let's say, an interim kind of a blocker which might be there. And why I'm saying that is because, one, you have the European and American brands heavily investing into electric vehicles. They are developing their own platforms, and more importantly, they are improving them. That's the core part of it. As you improve technology, the prices start going down. And similarly, even for some of the brands from China, they are going to have manufacturing facilities outside of China, which don't necessarily have impact with respect to some of these tariffs. So while in the short run, yes, there might be a bit of, let's say, a challenge. In the longer run, I also have a view that these tariffs will not be continued. They will eventually be taken away, as we have seen with many of these other elements. And there will be a proper competitive market across the world.
Okay, anecdotally, when I look out, I do see more EVs than ever. I don't want to put you all on the spot, but I personally don't drive an EV, at least not yet. I don't think either of my producers drive an EV yet. Do each of you drive EVs?
Not yet. I still drive a 10-year-old SUV. I'm in the market for getting another car, which would be an EV. Again, as a consumer, I have not found the right product for me yet. It's not a price issue for me. It's more of a product availability issue. When I do, I'll most likely buy one.
Awesome.
For me, of course, of course, we would expect this. I am driving EV since 2 years, and it is an absolute pleasure to drive electric vehicle. Even once I drove internal combustion engine. For me, I think once you go electric, you never come back. Once you basically overcome the obstacles and the barriers for you to enter electric vehicle, you will never come back. And why? I would say because there is the rational side of it. So when we purchase a new technology, you start the interest emotionally. Then the rational side kicks in. Where am I going to really charge? So I am obviously lucky enough to live in a villa and my own house that I could immediately, even before my car was delivered, I put my home charging. So one of the job is done. So then I'm also lucky enough to work in a workspace that actually have also charging facilities for me. And plus, I can use the already existing public charging, and my own driving habits is fitting this one perfectly. Since 2 years, I haven't gone to single time in a petrol station. The incredible saving that you could have because petrol may be cheaper here than the rest of the world, but also don't forget electricity is also cheaper. So there is a ratio of when you drive, I'm talking about retail customers, drive 15 to 20,000 kilometers even per year, is a ratio of 1 to 4. So you could slash your fuel consumption cost by 75%. And so these are all the rational things. But another thing is that, and this is where we are always focusing on test drive, then where the excitement comes from. Because we have two sides when we purchase something. We need to be excited. Otherwise, yes, of course, I can put also in the electric vehicles, there are significantly less moving parts. What does it mean? It means that your maintenance cost will be also significantly lesser. And your intervals for maintenance is significantly less. And so it doesn't need you to go to a service center every year. It's actually every 2 years. And the cost is so little because you don't have an engine, you don't use oil, and so many significantly. So basically the tires and then the few other bits and bobs is the service and maintenance cost for it. But again, this is rational, but actually driving pleasure. Personally, I love electric because of the driving pleasure. Because compared to an internal combustion engine, where the engine needs to rev up to give you the maximum torque, electric motor does it immediately. So this instant acceleration. And then obviously, of course, for the V8 fans, V12 fans that love the engine roaring sound, it is something else. I also understand this, but this driving of this technology, and also the cars are coming, as we call it, smartphone on wheels, with the apps, with the connectivity, with everything is like so intuitive. It feels like when you go back to internal combustion engine, you time travel a bit. So, and this is also the tech side and this driving pleasure for the ones who are convinced with this one. This is another part is actually when in this debate, it is, I think, significantly less spoken.
Well, in this debate, ultimately, I think we touched on two really good points in this podcast, and that is the point you made, Hasan, is once you go EV, few, if any of those EV drivers want to go back. And to Aravind, the point you made that more people than ever currently driving internal combustion engine cars are contemplating buying EVs. So somewhere in between that chasm is going to be some interesting developments in the weeks, months, and years ahead. That's it for this episode of Business Extra Podcast. Make sure you subscribe to Business Extra on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasting content so you can get the newest episodes as soon as they come out. This episode was produced by Doa Farid and Arthur Edison. I'm your host, Cody Combs, future editor for The National. Thanks so much for listening.